This is Lake Peigneur, or at least sort of. In 1980, something happened here beneath the surface that would forever and drastically change the lake and the surrounding area. It would also be one of the most violent and destructive phenomena to have ever occurred. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The sun had yet to rise in the morning of November 20th, 1980, but the air inside Jefferson Island salt mine was filled with the smell of machinery and damp salt. Dim lights flickered along the tunnels of the vast cavernous chambers that had been carved from the earth. And it was just another morning for Junius Gaddison, the mine's master electrician, as he worked on the 1,300-foot level, gathering electrical supplies from the storeroom. Junius was no stranger to life underground. The mine operated around the clock, 7 days a week, and he had spent years working in the mine deep beneath Lake Peigneur, surrounded by massive walls of basically pure salt. It was a routine job for him, but even the most unremarkable tasks can be dangerous inside a twisting underground maze of tunnels. Just as he was reaching for a spool of electrical wire, though, something happened. A muffled, unfamiliar sound echoed through the tunnel. It was in the distance, but something about it made him pause. He then set the wire down, listening. Then there was another hollow bang, and then another. These were not the usual sounds of mining he was used to hearing. Obviously, underground work is filled with noise, but the longer a miner works in a mine, the more a miner can tell what sounds normally correspond with the work of the day. This was something beyond normal. It wasn't from distant drilling or the vibration of equipment. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw a thin stream of murky water creeping along the mine floor. He then turned toward the water and saw something even more alarming. Fuel drums, which are usually stacked neatly near the storage area, were moving along the shallow stream. And then it hit him. This could only mean that water, which was not supposed to be there at all, was from the lake above and was pouring into the mine. Without hesitation, he hit the power switch that controlled the lights and the levels below him and flashed the evacuation signal. This communicated to everyone that they needed to get out immediately. Then, grabbing the nearest phone, he shouted into it, calling the hoist operator to lower the mine's only elevator. Somewhere deep below, dozens of men had been working and were now aware that time was running out. Above them, on the lake, something even more horrific was unfolding. For decades leading up to this, Lake Peigneur had been a quiet, unassuming body of water located in southern Louisiana. Spanning about 1,300 acres, it was shallow, barely 10 feet or 3 meters at its deepest, and it was a popular spot for fishing bass and perch. Few who fished or boated on the lake, though, ever thought about what was beneath its surface. And understandably, because they couldn't see the labyrinth of tunnels carved into something known as the Jefferson Island Salt Dome. This geological formation, formed over millions of years, was one of 5 in the region beneath Louisiana that were like buried mountains of pure white salt. Over time, shifting geology had pushed these domes upward, creating these small, isolated landforms that dotted the area. This salt was valuable, so in 1919, the Diamond Crystal Salt Company began mining operations beneath Lake Peigneur using the room and pillar method, which you may be familiar with from other videos on the channel. This style of mining requires leaving behind large natural pillars to act as supports to stabilize the mine, and the Jefferson Island salt mine formed underground rooms nearly 100 feet or 30 meters wide and 80 feet or 24 meters tall. Over the years, the mine became an economic powerhouse, employing hundreds of workers across its sprawling network of tunnels. Some of these were as deep as 1,500 feet or 457 meters. There was, however, another force competing for the riches beneath the lake. The same geological shifts that had created these salt domes also made them prime locations for petroleum deposits. Oil companies eventually caught on to this, and they had been drilling near Jefferson Island for years, hoping to tap into the natural reservoirs that often formed around the salt domes. By 1980, Texaco, one of the world's largest oil companies, had secured the rights to drill an exploratory well on Lake Peigneur. Their goal was to determine whether there was oil below, and if so, extract it. The company then hired Wilson Brothers, a contractor, to operate a floating drilling rig just offshore. It was a standard job and one that had been done countless times before, and so neither the Texaco engineers nor the Diamond Crystal miners believed there was any risk of interference between their operations. The mine had its own maps detailing the vast chambers below, and Texaco had surveyed the lake bed before drilling. And yet, somewhere in those calculations, something had gone terribly wrong. As Junius watched water rising in the mine, he didn't know what caused it yet, but on the surface just above him, the Texaco drilling rig was already sinking, and the peaceful lake he had worked beneath for years was about to disappear forever. Above ground, Lake Peigneur was deceptively calm at first. The crew aboard the Texaco platform was focused on their drill, which had become stuck. At 4:30 a.m., while boring into the lake bed, the 14-inch drill bit had suddenly jammed at 1,228 feet or 374 meters. This wasn't entirely unusual. Drilling through compacted sediment and geological formations often led to snags. The crew then attempted these standard fixes like moving the pipe, rotating it, and applying pressure, but nothing worked. By 5:45 a.m., the next crew arrived to take over, and as they ran through the routine troubleshooting process, a few workers began to hear something strange. There were a series of faint popping sounds from deep beneath the earth. Then at 6:30 a.m., the drilling platform tilted slightly. The shift was barely noticeable at first, but the rig was no longer level. Some of the workers then wondered aloud whether the lake bed was unstable, and just in case, they decided to abandon the platform and head for the shore. Then, an hour later at 7:25 a.m., the rig suddenly lurched hard to one side. Metal groaned, cables snapped, and the entire structure began to collapse. The crew could only watch in disbelief as the drilling rig sank into the lake, disappearing into what should have only been 10 feet of water. This seemed impossible. The drilling rig was taller than the water was deep, yet despite this fact, it completely vanished below the water. Then, the lake itself began to move. The water directly above the drilling site swirled, forming a dark whirlpool. The current then accelerated, growing stronger by the second, and soon it was like the surface of the lake was collapsing inward, as if a bathtub plug had just been pulled from a drain. It didn't take long for people to realize this was no ordinary drilling accident. The Texaco crew, now safely on shore, could only stare in stunned horror. A suction force stronger than anything they'd ever seen before began dragging objects towards the center of the growing vortex. In fact, 11 supply barges moored nearby were pulled in one by one into the spiraling whirlpool. The most terrifying consequences, however, were still unseen. Beneath the surface, inside the salt mine, 55 men were still underground, and the water was coming for them. In the depths of the Jefferson Island salt mine, the sense of urgency was growing. After Junius had triggered the evacuation signal, the underground tunnels were in confused chaos. Word spread fast, but the miners still didn't really know what was going on. The 1,500-foot level of the mine, where most men were working, was nearly a quarter mile below the surface. And down there, conveyor belts carried salt, equipment was loud, and trucks continued moving. Then the phone lines went dead shortly after, and the first of the water arrived. It started as a trickle at first, streaming down the walls and pooling at their feet, but in less than a minute, it was a full-blown torrent of dark, rapidly rising water. On the 1,300-foot level, Junius and his crew were already waist-deep in water as they struggled toward the mine's only elevator. The hoist operator had lowered the cage, but there was no telling how long they had before the tunnels completely collapsed. Meanwhile, back on the 1,500-foot level, Foreman Earl Dundas realized just how dire the situation was. He and a handful of men raced against the rising flood, yelling to their coworkers to drop everything and move, because salt mines, for all their size and depth, were incredibly fragile once compromised. Unlike coal and stone mines, which could sometimes withstand flooding, salt dissolves in water. This meant the pillars that supported the mine were already crumbling, and as more of the lake poured in, the mine was literally melting from the inside out. The only way out was the elevator shaft, and everyone knew it. So in the darkness, boots splashed through knee-high water, and men gripped each other's arms to keep from falling as they navigated through the collapsing tunnels. The deafening roar of rushing water filled the mine, drowning out shouted instructions. Above, the elevator cage arrived at the 1,300-foot level where Junius and his team had been waiting. They then crammed inside, dripping wet and shaking before signaling for the operator to bring them up. The metal cage then lurched upward, carrying them toward the surface as the lower levels began to vanish beneath the flood, but there were still dozens of men below and time was running out. On the 1,500-foot level, Earl and his crew reached the base of the elevator shaft and entered, only to find a small group still running towards them as they ascended. These were the final handful of men who had been working deeper in the tunnels. But instead of leaving them behind, Earl made the split-second decision to turn back and guide them through the rising waters. Above them as well, the hoist operator waited for a final load as the shaft trembled and salt and debris rained down from the collapsing ceiling. Finally, the last group of miners reached the cage. Earl was then the last to step inside and slammed the metal gate shut behind him. The elevator shaft then jerked violently as it made its final ascent. The water had almost reached them, and by the time the cage was halfway up, the 1,500-foot level had completely disappeared, swallowed by the lake. When the final group of miners stepped onto solid ground, drenched and gasping for breath, the hoist operator cut power to the mine because there was nothing left to save below. Back above ground, Lake Peigneur was no longer a lake. It was a swirling vortex, pulling in everything in its path. What had begun as a small whirlpool above the sunken Texaco drilling rig had now grown to monstrous proportions, dragging in anything near the shoreline. By the time the last miners reached the surface, the land itself was even giving way. Even a tugboat with its engines at full throttle fought desperately to resist the pull, but it was no match for the force of the draining lake. It was dragged back into the vortex and vanished, with its crew escaping to safety just in time. Along the shoreline, even entire sections of Jefferson Island crumbled and were pulled into the growing sinkhole. Trees also tipped over, exposing their roots for only seconds before vanishing into the swirling water. In total, 65 acres of land disappeared into the whirlpool. The destruction was unlike anything the people on shore had ever seen. As the mine continued to collapse beneath the lake, trapped air from the caverns was also forced upward, starting as low, hissing gusts from the mine's air shafts and quickly becoming something more violent. Then suddenly, a geyser erupted, shooting a column of water and debris 400 feet or 122 meters into the air. The force of the explosion apparently rattled windows miles away, and as you might imagine, witnesses could do nothing but watch as everything around them was pulled into the earth, consumed by a force beyond their comprehension. But even after Lake Peigneur had all but vanished, the disaster was far from over, as the Gulf of Mexico soon came rushing in. For as long as anyone could remember, the nearby canal flowed in a single direction, which was out of Lake Peigneur southward toward Vermilion Bay, where it emptied into the Gulf of Mexico. It was a quiet waterway, and again, used mostly by fishermen and small boats traveling between the lake and the bay. But after the sinkhole swallowed the lake, something inexplicable happened. The current first stopped and then began moving the opposite direction. Without warning, the canal reversed course. Instead of flowing outward, it began rushing backward, funneling millions of gallons of salt water from the Gulf straight into the lake bed. And with so much water pouring in at once, the sudden reversal of the canal created an extraordinary sight. In the middle of what used to be the lake, a raging waterfall 50 feet or 15 meters high had formed. And for 2 days, the waterfall continued, sending billions of gallons of seawater flooding into the space where Lake Peigneur used to be. By the time the flow stabilized, the lake had been changed forever. After the sinkhole formed and the Gulf of Mexico came rushing in, everything was different. The lake was now 200 feet or 61 meters deep and claimed the title of the deepest in Louisiana. Its once fresh waters were now saltwater, permanently altering the ecosystem, and fish populations and plant life were devastated. Although the lake refilled, it was not the same place it had been before November 20th, 1980. The event had physically reshaped the landscape, leaving behind a deeper, stranger body of water that stood as a permanent reminder of what had happened there. Finally, in the days following the disaster, the surface of the lake was eerily calm again. The whirlpool had disappeared and the land stopped collapsing, and the geyser had gone silent. But the people who witnessed it would never forget what they'd seen. In the aftermath of the disaster, investigators were left with an unsettling truth. Despite the enormous scale of the destruction, no one could say with absolute certainty how it happened. Normally, after a mining accident or industrial failure, experts could examine the wreckage and reconstruct events to determine exactly what went wrong. At Lake Peigneur, there was nothing left to examine. The Texaco drilling rig, along with all its equipment, was gone. The mine itself had also collapsed and was buried beneath millions of gallons of water. The borehole that had punctured the mine had also widened into an enormous sinkhole, erasing any trace of its original position. So with no physical evidence remaining, investigators only had maps, drilling records, and witness testimonies to piece together what had occurred. 2 theories then emerged as the most likely causes of the disaster. One possibility was that Texaco's drilling crew had miscalculated their coordinates and unknowingly bored directly into the salt mine. Even a small error could have placed their drill far closer to the mine than intended, triggering the catastrophe. The other theory placed the blame on the Diamond Crystal Salt Company, suggesting that the mine's maps had been outdated or inaccurate. If the underground chambers extended farther than expected, then it was possible Texaco had drilled exactly where they had intended to, only to puncture a tunnel that, according to old mine records, should not have been there. In August of 1981, the Mine Safety and Health Administration released its official report on the disaster. Their findings confirmed the sequence of events. Texaco's drill had punctured the salt mine, allowing water to rush in, dissolve in the support pillars, and trigger the collapse. When it came time to assigning blame, however, the report stopped short. With all the physical evidence destroyed in the disaster, there was no way to definitively determine whether the fault lay in Texaco's incorrect drilling location or Diamond Crystal's mine maps. But while the government never placed full responsibility on either party, the financial consequences were unavoidable. Texaco and Wilson Brothers Drilling, the contractor operating the rig, agreed to pay $32 million to Diamond Crystal Salt Company for the destruction of the mine. In addition, Texaco, Wilson Brothers, and Diamond Crystal also paid out $12.8 million to Live Oak Gardens, which was the botanical garden that had lost a significant portion of its land when Jefferson Island collapsed into the whirlpool. The Jefferson Island salt mine would never reopen, but Diamond Crystal continued operations for a few years after the disaster. However, with the entire underground structure permanently compromised, the company finally shut the mine down for good in December of 1986. Even now, more than 4 decades later, the Lake Peigneur disaster remains one of the strangest and most catastrophic industrial accidents in history. Yet the most astonishing fact of all was that no human lives were lost. Against impossible odds, all 55 miners trapped below the lake escaped. Their survival was the result of quick thinking, strict evacuation procedures, and the leadership of men like Junius and Earl, who wasted no time in recognizing the danger and acting on it. Unlike many of the other mine disasters covered in the channel, Diamond Crystal maintained a tight operation that prioritized worker safety. The mine's emergency drills were held every 6 months like clockwork, and every miner inside knew exactly what to do when the evacuation signal was given, avoiding what could have been one of the worst mining tragedies in history. For those who witnessed the disaster firsthand, though, as you might imagine, the memories never faded. The whirlpool, the land collapse, the eerie reversal of the canal, and the 400-foot geyser blasting into the sky seem more like something out of science fiction than real life. Even now, many struggle to believe that a lake actually drained into the earth, pulling in an entire ecosystem with it. The legacy of the disaster lives on in Lake Peigneur's new depths, in the lost mine beneath its surface, and in the unanswered questions that still remain. Although legal battles were settled and companies moved on, the lake has never truly recovered. It remains to this day a different lake than the one that existed before the disaster, carrying with it a story unlike any other. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.